Parshva Driste. Most of you know that I like to drop heavy hints about Parshva Driste from time to time. And since we have been doing this series of technical classes on Driste, it just felt so important to place emphasis on the Parshva Driste before we bring that to a conclusion. It's just such a good opportunity to once again circle back and point to this technical meditation instruction, because if you can understand what it's both revealing and retraining on a meditative level, it unlocks a lot about the Patanjalian design of the method to train you into the nature of consciousness and free up more degrees of freedom for how you use your own mind in daily life. So Parshva Driste is teaching us about how objectification works. Most minds, by default, proceed through the world by congealing experience and process into objects. That is a thing that happens in our mind, and without the sort of meta cognition that a meditation practice or just a really reflective mind can give you, we tend to think that the objects that the mind creates are real. And then we treat people and processes as objects, and the world goes on in an objectified state, right? So most of the drishtis are on body. And as we've been doing in this study of Parshva Driste, they're ultimately giving you a way of working with the visual sense that cultivates the possibility of svadhyaya, of self-study. So much of the time, depending on how visual you are by nature, the visual sense tends to be highly stimulated, and there's a sense of gaining information and even like taking information from the world through the visual senses, right? Especially if you're in a group environment. And so Driste, especially when it's on body throughout most of the Ashtanga practice, there's a sense of like, oh, I'm going to create this soft, centering landing point for that part of my consciousness, for example, on my thumb, in a way that frees up that seeking of the visual sense to reverse on itself and go inside, right? So I see people experience this all the time. This is the subtlest expression of Trishtana, which is an incredibly deep, transformative meditation practice. It's also the last part that you learn. You know, I've been, in recent years, for the first time in a long time, learning new material in Mysore. And so my teacher in India, Sharat, will give me a posture from fourth. And my first question, once I've figured out the mechanics, because of me, is, oh, well, what's the drishti for this posture? And he consistently says, don't ask me. I want to see that you've understood the physicality of the posture, the internal locks that you need to do it safely, and that you're breathing before I'm going to instruct you in the drishti. And that's just the method. In general, you look to stabilize the physical before you actually look inside in this really deep way that drishti does for you, right? So we're all ready to do this in basically like the whole first half of the primary series. And yet you get very few opportunities in that first half of the primary series to take the gaze off body and hopefully maintain, when the gaze goes off body, that sense that you've already had of the internal view from being on body, right? So the first one, hilariously, is Uttita Hasta Parangushtasana, where there's a side gaze, and hopefully you've already gone through this process of wanting to look at the floor to kind of get your bearings, and then freeing up that sort of eye coordination that gives you your balance to actually take Parshva Drishti. And then you get it again in Marichasana C and D. So it's pretty rare. Most of the time you get to keep the gaze on body. Towards the end of the practice, you also get some Ordhva Drishtis, which are another level of complexity as well. So what we've learned and what I've really seen expressed in the technical series we've done on Nasagraya Drishti is that you really understand that the gaze lands softly wherever it lands, that you use it to center, both physically and metaphorically, that its origins are also soft. You know, we started talking about looking from behind the eyes and did that bit on the sphenoid of awareness of where the optic nerve is coming through, so that the wisdom of not looking at, just looking, is something that you really understand on a physiological level. So what happens when you take all that and you drop the drishti into space? And in many cases, you're in a room where there are plenty of distractions associated with your daily life, or you're in a community with people that, you know, you think that you know. Very often, the mind will go into that looking at modality. In the same way it's like at first you're like studying your thumbnail instead of just resting the gaze and studying the mind, right? We'll do the same thing. We'll make a thing of what's out there. What Alfred North Whitehead, as you know, called reification. What more popularly is called objectification. And what many, many spiritual literatures in many registers have named in their own ways, because this is something about the nature of mind that is a little bit reductive, right? So if you're looking off body at a bunch of apparently people and floorboards and, you know, windows and whatever, very often the mind will want to, again, go into a place of describing, objectifying, and knowing, looking at and gathering information about the visual field that's off body. And the training for Parshva Drishti is to not know, to actually be able to watch that part of the mind that is actively constructing objects and narratives and things. It's reifying and narrativizing the experience. So usually we need objects and narratives to get through the day. But in the process of practice, we are learning to actually go into non-conceptual mind, which is a kind of mind that most traditions say is deeper than the conceptualizing, objectifying mind, right? So if you've taken a good high school physics, or you're just interested in popular physics, you know that we went through this phase in the 20th century of moving from sort of particle to wave physics, recognizing that the physical world itself is not really physical. It's on a technical level made up of processes. And then physics moved on to even more subtle understandings of what matter even is. But I want to talk about a crackpot 1940s kind of science that did a similar thing in the realm of language, just to show you that this insight of being able to deconstruct the objectifying mind is something that comes up in discipline after discipline after discipline when researchers of all different kinds, meditators and scientists alike, get to a place of wanting to see behind the constructed nature of the object-filled world. So again, this is kind of a crackpot phase of linguistic science, but it's super interesting because it shows a really analogous process of awareness of the psychological effects of creating objects in everyday life. So there were a bunch of experimental linguistics in the early 20th century, and kind of at the end of an era of that, you can look this up. There was a really cool linguist who came up with an alternate expression of language called E prime, English prime. And the insight here was that the English language is full of nouns. We're actually a super noun-heavy language. And if you want to objectify nouns, create things in the world, you need the infinitive to be. And most of you who have learned a second language with English as your base, you know that because we are so oriented around the infinitive word to be, or is, am, are, was, were, it's almost the first thing you always learn in whatever second language you're acquiring, just because it maps on to the way that the English language mind thinks. Like, we want to be able to talk about isness out in the world, right? So E prime was an experiment in linguistics where all forms of to be, is, am, are, was, were removed as a possibility for constructing the world. So what that means is you don't get to make objects. You use verbal communication in a way that describes processes. So what this reveals, it's super tedious. It's almost impossible to do. Like, whole books have been written in E prime, but it's just complex in a way that's not useful, except for if you're going to study the way that language constructs the mind. What it does is show you the way that we're always creating objects out of processes. So, for example, feelings. I am, insert state of being. Despondent, joyful, hopeless, I am, right? In E prime, you don't get to say, I am that. You get to say, I experience hopelessness. I am feeling, or I am filled with XYZ characteristics of despondency, right? So that's a feeling state. Let's think about a person as a category. So he is American. You don't get to say that in E prime. That's, again, like constructing of an object out of what's essentially a process, right? So the way to get yourself around that in E prime is to think about what are you actually, like, what's the actual situation that causes him to have the characteristics of Americanness adhered to him. He travels with an American passport. There's no is, am, are, was, were there, right? He pays taxes to the American government. All of a sudden, if you're languaging in this way, the objectification of nationhood and identity drops away and you're focused on process. The whole world of so-called objects is the same, right? So this is a chair. Well, then you look at use and process. We use this to rest our weary bones at the end of the day, right? And so on. The reason I bring this up and physics up is just in case you benefit from kind of proving to yourself that there's some value in examining the inner effects of objectifying modes of understanding the world. So you only do it for 5 breaths in the state of the asana, in these few asanas that we get to do it in, right? But being able to telescope back into the mode of not objectifying the world, if you do it consistently. And what I see in sophisticated practitioners is that part of awareness, having been primed and practiced daily for a brief period, comes online as a resource for being in the world, when actually the objectifying nature of our meaning structures is not helping. And you want to be able to see through the reductive modes of meaning making and understanding that we tend to take for granted. So most of you have heard this already, but in case you haven't, The most difficult meditation instruction I have ever received is one that my teacher Zen got from one of his teachers, which is to go through the world and not make an object out of any experience. And that mode of being is a super mystical mode of being, where the processual nature of human beings, of feeling states, of matter, of thought is, you don't just remind yourself on a conceptual level of the nature of flow and impermanence in the world, but you actually, on a technical, perceptual level, attend to the non-thingness of experience. Again, it can be tedious, and when you're first trying it out, it can actually just be really dissociative and not helpful. But being able to shift into that register, again, means that you have more degrees of freedom in the ways that you actually use your mind in daily life. So this is something that shows up in meditative and mystical traditions the world over across time. And it's right here, hiding in plain sight, super deep technical instruction on the nature of mind, not just when it comes to being with the self, but also once you're looking at the world, the way that the mind is being with the world. So we'll do some technical stuff this Wednesday on Objectification Driste, but I wanted to discuss the philosophical level of it outside of that, so that we don't get the narrative mind too excited when we get to practice. All right, see you tomorrow, and see you for the technical piece on Wednesday.